Picture this, you're browsing medieval job listings, and right there between village blacksmith and professional plague victim, you spot an opening that makes your stomach drop. Wanted. Reliable individual for specialized government position. Must be comfortable with screaming, good with ropes, and have absolutely zero social life. Benefits include steady pay, job security, and complete isolation from polite society. Congratulations, you just found your calling as a medieval torturer. But before you start sharpening anything, let me take you through what this life actually looked like. Because spoiler alert, it wasn't what you think. You didn't wake up one morning at age 30 and decide to become a professional pain specialist. Like most medieval careers, this one chose you long before you were old enough to run away from it. You were probably 8 or 9, standing in your family's cramped cottage that smelled like wet straw and yesterday's disappointment, when someone first noticed you had the wrong kind of curiosity. While other children played with wooden swords and imagined slaying dragons, you were the kid who found dead mice behind the bakery and wanted to know how their little joints worked. Not in a "this child is gifted" way, more in a "this child makes the priest uncomfortable during Sunday service" way. Your parents probably exchanged worried glances when you asked why chickens stopped moving after you squeezed their necks, or when you organized your collection of bird skulls by size. The village butcher, your father perhaps, noticed you never flinched when he split open a pig. The herb woman, maybe your mother, saw how you watched her grind bones for medicine without looking away. You weren't violent, just unnaturally fascinated by how things stopped working. And in a medieval village where most people preferred their curiosity limited to "will it rain tomorrow?" and "is the bread moldy?", your interests marked you as different. That difference caught the attention of the wrong people. Or the right people, depending on how you looked at it. One day, a town magistrate or perhaps a visiting official looked at you, small, quiet, observant, and made a decision that would define the rest of your life. He's not squeamish, is he? That question was basically a medieval job interview, and congratulations, you passed. Soon after, you found yourself walking toward the edge of town with a small sack of belongings and instructions that sounded like the beginning of a very dark fairy tale. But this wasn't about finding your fortune or rescuing a princess. This was about learning a trade that would make you indispensable and completely untouchable at the same time. Your new home wasn't with family, because this job didn't run in families the way baking or farming did. Instead, you were handed over to a man everyone called Uncle Gregor, though he wasn't anyone's actual uncle. Uncle Gregor lived just far enough from the village center that decent people didn't have to walk past his door on their way to church, but close enough that he could be summoned quickly when needed. His house had no garden because, frankly, what was the point? It had a locked shed that you learned not to ask about, and a surprisingly extensive collection of ropes organized by thickness and length. Gregor himself was a practical man who didn't believe in explanations, small talk, or emotional support. He communicated primarily in grunts, nods, and the occasional "don't touch that unless you want to lose a finger." Your first weeks were spent learning the basics, which weren't actually about hurting people. They were about maintenance. You scrubbed stains off wooden benches without asking what caused them. You oiled metal mechanisms without inquiring about their purpose. You learned to organize chains by size and function, to fix a wooden crank without getting your fingers caught, and to mix cleaning solutions that smelled like regret and vinegar. In the evenings, Gregor would sit by the fire with a dented tin cup, staring into the flames like they held answers to questions he'd stopped asking. You sat across from him, trying not to breathe too loudly or exist too obviously. Sometimes he'd toss you a book, not the Bible or anything cheerful, but thick volumes with pages that smelled like ash, and contained detailed diagrams about joint tolerances and pressure points. You didn't understand everything, but you understood it was important. The silence was part of your education. When a boy from the village asked what you were learning, you answered truthfully, how to keep things from breaking too early. He never spoke to you again, which taught you another valuable lesson about your future social life. By your second month, you knew how to tie 4 different types of knots, identify bones by shape and size, and clean metal equipment without letting rust take hold. You weren't being taught a craft. You were being taught discretion, patience, and the kind of silence that becomes second nature when your work requires it. But nothing quite prepared you for your first real day on the job, which didn't begin with ceremony or speeches about justice. It started with Gregor dropping a heavy iron key into your palm and saying, "Basement, you know the way," which was his version of "Welcome to the team." Down those creaking stone steps you went, torch in one hand and your sense of innocence in the other, though you'd probably been carrying that second thing for some time. The air grew colder with each step. Not refreshing cold like a mountain morning, but the kind of cold that settles into your bones and whispers suggestions you try not to hear. The room at the bottom wasn't large, but it made an impression. Low stone ceiling, walls that had never seen sunlight, and a wooden table in the center worn smooth by centuries of unpleasant conversations. Ropes hung on pegs like a particularly unsettling coat collection, and in the corner sat a bucket, always a bucket, with no explanation offered and none requested. Gregor didn't provide a tour or explain the equipment. He just pointed at things and expected you to understand. Clean that, oil this, never leave the wheel loose, last time it slipped and we almost had to get creative. You nodded because you were 15, maybe 16, and already too deep in to pretend you didn't know what getting creative might involve. That afternoon, someone was brought in, not for you to handle, not yet, but for you to observe and learn what Gregor called proper pacing. Apparently, even professional suffering had a rhythm, a timing that separated effective work from amateur flailing. You weren't asked to participate just to keep things tidy. Replace a cloth here, refill a water jug there, maintain the workspace while Gregor demonstrated why he'd been doing this job for longer than you'd been alive. When it was finished, he handed you a rag and gestured at the floor. Clean up, no one else does it. That was your welcome party. Later that evening, sitting by the fire with your hands still damp and smelling like old iron, you realized something important about your new profession. The job didn't want your opinions, your creativity, or your personal growth. It wanted quiet, competent hands that could follow instructions without asking uncomfortable questions. And apparently, yours fit the job description perfectly. After a few weeks of successful silence and basic competence, Gregor decided you were ready for what passed as a promotion in your line of work. He presented you with your first set of professional attire, which wasn't robes or ceremonial gear, just a leather apron, stiff from use, and a pair of gloves that had definitely seen things you probably didn't want to catalog. The apron was thick, cracked in places, and smelled like boiled vinegar with undertones of professional regret. The gloves were heavier than you expected, reinforced at the fingers to help with gripping things you didn't particularly want to touch, but absolutely had to handle. When you put them on, they fit perfectly, which was either fortunate or deeply unfortunate, depending on your perspective. There was no mask, no hood, no mysterious silhouette like in the traveling shows. Real torturers didn't get to hide behind dramatic costumes. You had a face, and everyone in town would eventually remember it, whether they wanted to or not. Out in the village, it didn't matter what you wore. People could tell what you did for a living just by looking at you. There was something in the posture, alert but slightly hunched, always ready to dodge accusations or unexpected confessions. The gloves became your signature piece, partly by choice, partly by necessity. You started wearing them everywhere, even when sweeping floors or eating meals, because you never knew when you'd be called upon to adjust something or someone. They were practical, protective, and served as an excellent conversation ender at social gatherings, not that you were invited to many. And then there were the boots, heavy, solid, designed for traction on stone floors that might be slippery for reasons nobody discussed in polite company. Walking in them produced a distinctive sound, a dull, final sort of thud that people learned to recognize from a distance. Mothers would grab their children when they heard it. Shopkeepers would suddenly become fascinated by their inventory. You once tried smiling at a girl near the village well. She took one look at your gloves, your boots, and your general aura of "I oil sharp things in my spare time," and promptly dropped her water bucket. Your uniform wasn't just leather and laces. It was a warning label that told the world, this person is necessary but not approachable. And that's exactly how everyone treated you, which brings us to the subject of your living arrangements and social life, or rather, the complete absence of the latter. Once you'd proven yourself capable of following instructions and not fainting at inappropriate moments, the town offered you housing. Calling it a house was generous. It was more of a stone rectangle attached to the municipal building, conveniently located next to your workplace. So convenient, in fact, that you could hear the sounds of late-night deliveries and conversations that definitely weren't about the weather. Your new home came with exactly 2 advantages: a door that locked and walls thick enough that most sounds didn't echo into your dreams. Most sounds, but not all. There were also distinctive smells, constant and puzzling. A mixture of damp wood, overboiled herbs, and something vaguely metallic that you learned not to investigate too closely. During your first week there, the local priest dropped off a bag of incense with a note that simply read, "Please use this." It was thoughtful in a foreboding sort of way, the kind of gift that says, "We care about you, but we also care about not smelling whatever you're working with." The location had its benefits beyond convenience. You were always close to work, tragically close in fact. If a magistrate needed a consultation at odd hours, you were 15 steps away. No excuses about bad weather or family obligations, just proximity-based professional duty. Your neighbors were non-existent, unless you counted the family of indifferent crows that nested near your roof and seemed to regard you as just another fixture in the landscape. You tried to make it homey with a wooden chair, a blanket, and an optimistic attempt at keeping a potted plant alive. The plant withered under the weight of its surroundings, as if even vegetation could sense what happened next door. You once hung a small tapestry on the wall for color. It fell down within a day, as if the house itself rejected attempts at cheerfulness. Sleep came eventually, fitful and shallow, broken by the sounds that leaked through stone walls and settled into your subconscious. You developed the ability to wake instantly, but never fully rest. The building wasn't haunted exactly, just saturated with memory that pressed against you in the silence like fog you couldn't brush away. Welcome to your new home, where privacy came at the cost of peace and security meant accepting that some sounds were just part of the background now. In theory, you were a respected civil servant performing an essential function for the community. In practice, you were about as popular as a tax collector with leprosy. People didn't exactly speak to you so much as around you, like you were a conversational pothole they were trying to avoid falling into. Walking into the tavern was an exercise in social geometry. You'd enter and watch entire tables develop sudden urgent fascinations with their bread crusts, their wine cups, anything that wasn't making eye contact with you. Children were hustled indoors when you appeared. Dogs barked at you, then seemed to reconsider and backed away. You weren't officially banned from public events, but somehow invitations never quite reached you. Weddings? Oh, the message must have gotten lost. Harvest festivals? We thought you were busy with your, ironwork. Your presence apparently didn't pair well with celebration, joy, or basic human happiness. At the market, merchants served you with the kind of strained politeness reserved for distant relatives they hoped wouldn't stay long. You got service, certainly, but it was fast, efficient, and came with an obvious desire for you to be somewhere else as quickly as possible. Your money was good, but somehow the bread was always slightly stale, the fruit a little too firm, and the cuts of meat definitely not the best available. Once, in a moment of optimism or stupidity, you tried to join a group of people near the well. They were laughing, sharing wine, telling stories about their perfectly normal lives. You approached with what you hoped was a friendly expression. One glance at your professional gloves and the conversation dissolved like sugar in warm water, leaving you standing there holding an empty bucket and your wounded dignity. Friendship wasn't impossible, just statistically unlikely. Other tradesmen had guilds, professional camaraderie, shared complaints about working conditions. Even the village drunk had drinking companions. You had Gregor, who once nodded approvingly and said, "You're less disappointing than most." It was the closest thing to praise you'd received in months. Romantic prospects were similarly bleak. If someone looked at you twice, it was usually to make sure they could describe you accurately to the authorities later. You didn't receive love letters or invitations to dances. Instead, you got notes slipped under your door that read things like, "Please don't take my husband. He's mostly innocent of whatever you think he did." Yet, you weren't exactly hated, because hatred requires passion, and most people preferred not to feel anything too strongly about you. You were regarded as necessary but unfortunate, like harsh weather or intestinal parasites. You weren't part of the community so much as adjacent to it, standing just outside the circle of normal human interaction, waiting to be summoned when polite society needed something unpleasant handled quietly. And most days, you preferred it that way. Social interaction was complicated and exhausting. Your work was straightforward, even if it was morally ambiguous and professionally isolating. But let me tell you where you really came alive. Your workspace, that narrow corridor behind the town hall where justice went to get its hands dirty. Your professional domain was affectionately known by the locals as that place, and they never needed to be more specific. Everyone knew what they meant. It wasn't just a room, it was a mood, an atmosphere thick enough to cut with one of your freshly sharpened implements. The stone walls weren't smooth. They had texture, character, little grooves and stains that told stories nobody wanted to hear but everyone remembered. No windows, just a single torch bracket near the entrance that somehow made the shadows more dramatic rather than less. No matter how many candles you lit, darkness always seemed to win the lighting battle. In the center stood your table, heavy oak, built to last and reinforced to handle whatever conversations took place on its surface. Ropes coiled neatly at each corner like stage props waiting for a performance nobody wanted to attend. Nearby was the chair, singular, specific, requiring no further description because everyone who saw it understood its purpose immediately. The walls displayed your tools with the organization of a dedicated craftsman. Hooks, clamps, screws, gears, the greatest hits of medieval persuasion techniques. Some looked practical and straightforward. Others appeared to have been designed by someone with a very creative imagination and questionable hobbies. There were devices with cranks, mechanisms with weights, and one contraption that rattled even when untouched, which you simply ignored out of self-preservation. In the corner stood the bucket, singular, eternal, requiring no explanation because explanations would have been uncomfortable for everyone involved. You cleaned it regularly out of professional duty, not curiosity. Some things were better left unexamined. The smell was complicated, layered like a wine you really didn't want to analyze. Damp stone, hot iron, old herbs, and something indefinable that clung to the air like an unwelcome memory. You tried various remedies. Fresh rushes on the floor, burning incense, hanging sachets of lavender. The room politely ignored all attempts at improvement. Gregor insisted on neatness and organization. A messy workspace reflects poorly on the profession, he'd say while aligning shackles with the precision of a cathedral architect. You learned to sweep daily, polish metal until it gleamed, and replace fraying rope before it failed at crucial moments. This wasn't about cruelty, it was about craftsmanship and customer service. You didn't decorate or personalize the space. No artwork, no flowers, just a shelf for your gloves and a small bench where you sometimes sat between sessions, listening to the way silence could develop its own particular hum. Yet, it was undeniably yours. No one else entered uninvited. No one else touched the equipment, partly out of respect, mostly out of profound reluctance. And here's what nobody tells you about becoming a professional in this field. The job requires mathematics. Not the pleasant kind involving profit calculations or architectural measurements, but a grimmer form of arithmetic dealing with angles, pressure, joint tolerances, and consciousness duration under controlled medieval conditions. You learned, through experience that was unfortunately always someone else's experience, that the average shoulder could handle 7 complete rotations before something important gave way. There were no textbooks or official formulas, just careful observation, mental calculations, and the kind of intuitive understanding usually associated with master craftsmen or battlefield surgeons. Gregor had taught you the fundamentals. 3 turns for encouragement, 4 for honesty, 5 if they're still lying about the stolen goat. He wasn't being humorous. Medieval justice was obsessed with proportionality, finding that perfect balance between enough pressure to encourage truthfulness and so much that you'd have to explain awkward details to visiting bishops. Your tools didn't come with instruction manuals, but you learned their personalities like a musician learns their instrument. The wheel turned smoothly when properly oiled. The vise creaked when over-tightened. The iron collar had a sweet spot between secure and unfortunate. Precision was everything, because despite what people assumed, you weren't just randomly flailing until someone screamed the right information. In reality, you were closer to a specialized chef than a brute. Timing, pressure, temperature control, all crucial elements that required skill, experience, and careful attention to detail. The difference was that nobody applauded when you finished your work successfully. Over time, you developed an almost supernatural sense for reading people. You could look at someone and estimate with disturbing accuracy how many minutes they'd last before reconsidering their entire approach to truthfulness. It wasn't pride, just pattern recognition combined with professional experience. But the worst part wasn't when you were wrong. It was when your calculations proved consistently accurate, because that's when magistrates started relying on your expertise. He hasn't confessed yet. Give him the usual treatment, they'd say, like ordering stew at a roadside inn. You weren't a monster or a sadist. You were a highly skilled professional with an unfortunately specialized calculator calibrated in screams per minute. Speaking of magistrates, let's discuss your clientele and how your services were requested, because nobody ever just walked up and asked politely. Most days, you were professionally invisible. People saw you, certainly, but they looked through you, around you, past you to something more pleasant on the horizon. Unless, of course, they needed something. Then suddenly you were essential, indispensable, the most important person in the entire municipality. A magistrate would appear at your door looking harried and suspiciously polite. "We need some clarity on a situation. Nothing excessive, just encouragement toward truthfulness." They never mentioned justice or fairness, just results delivered efficiently and quietly. Sometimes it was a priest insisting this was all about spiritual welfare. We must guide this soul toward repentance. Guidance in this context involved rope, carefully applied heat, and a room with excellent acoustics. Even merchants occasionally sent discreet messages that rival traders had been spreading rumors about their grain quality. Nothing official, you understand. But if you happen to be adjusting your equipment today, perhaps a word with certain individuals about honesty and commerce. You were never formally hired for these tasks. That would have implied official complicity, and everyone preferred maintaining plausible deniability. Instead, you received suggestions, implications, and small purses of coins left at your door with notes reading, "For maintaining civic order." Order was always fashionable and apparently required constant maintenance. But once the job was completed, the silence returned immediately. The magistrate went back to pretending he didn't know your name. The priest forgot your soul needed saving. The merchant avoided eye contact while overcharging you for onions. Your usefulness had a very specific shelf life, roughly equivalent to 2 screams and a confession. And then you returned to being a necessary but regrettable fixture. Your reward wasn't gratitude or recognition, just continued employment, a roof over your head, and the occasional loaf of bread that wasn't entirely stale. In many ways, you were like a bucket of water during a fire. Nobody thought about it until smoke started rising. Then everyone wanted to know where the torturer was, and afterward, just damp floors and footsteps fading quickly into the distance. But let's talk about the occupational hazards nobody mentioned during your apprenticeship, starting with the acoustics. Your workspace was built from stone. Stone floors, stone walls, stone ceiling, all very durable and all absolutely terrible for sound management. Medieval architecture wasn't designed with noise reduction in mind. If anything, it seemed specifically engineered to celebrate sound, especially the kinds of sounds that made dinner less appetizing for everyone in the general vicinity. When work-related vocalizations occurred, they didn't just happen once and fade away politely. They bounced enthusiastically off every surface, ricocheted down corridors, echoed through water basins, traveled up stairwells, and on particularly humid days, seemed to seep directly through stone walls into your sleeping quarters. The sounds lingered like unwelcome guests who refused to take hints about leaving. You'd finish a professional consultation, clean your tools methodically, wash your hands carefully, and mutter something philosophical like, "Well, that was more complicated than expected." Yet, still, you'd hear faint echoes somewhere in the ceiling, as if the building was trying to preserve audio memories for posterity. Gregor called it environmental feedback. You tried various solutions, stuffing straw into wall cracks, rearranging furniture, even asking the blacksmith about sound-dampening panels. He stared at you like you'd requested silk curtains for a plague house, which was probably fair. Eventually, you adapted, learning to distinguish fresh sounds from delayed echoes. You could even tell which reverberations were from that morning's work versus 3 days ago. It became a grim form of audio archaeology, cataloging the ghosts of conversations past. The townspeople claimed not to hear anything, but they also claimed you weren't technically part of the community, which was a diplomatic way of saying, "We hear everything. We're just pretending it's distant thunder. At night, the acoustics became worse. The workspace was too quiet, making every small sound seem amplified and significant. One creaking floorboard, one settling stone, and suddenly you were sitting upright wondering if the equipment had achieved consciousness and decided to hold conversations without you. You started sleeping with your gloves on, not for protection, just familiarity. They felt safe, reliable, like, if necessary, you could grab a tool and establish dominance over whatever sounds were disturbing your rest. Some practitioners in your field reportedly went insane from the constant audio memories. You didn't lose your mind exactly. You just got accustomed to being followed everywhere by reverberation. The job didn't haunt you in the traditional sense. The leftover acoustics did, and frankly, that seemed worse. At least ghosts had the courtesy to be obviously supernatural. Echo was just persistently, annoyingly real. Now, let's discuss compensation, because you'd assume a job involving confessions, dislocated joints, and the occasional cooperative nobleman would come with decent pay. You'd be spectacularly wrong. Your salary wasn't just inadequate. It was creative, unpredictable, and occasionally included livestock. Officially, you were employed by municipal authorities. Unofficially, you were funded by whatever coins could be scraped together from fines, voluntary donations, and purses left by people hoping their relatives might survive questioning with all major joints still functional. Some weeks brought silver coins. Other weeks brought turnips and assurances that this represents the current value of justice in our community. Once you received a chicken as payment. It was not a good chicken. It looked like it had already heard professional rumors about your line of work and was deeply concerned about its future prospects. There was no official salary, just vague promises that your services are valued by the community, which translated roughly to, please don't ask for specifics about money. You kept careful records in a small notebook, not because you expected back pay, but because maintaining accounts made you feel like someone with a legitimate profession rather than a municipal necessity everyone preferred to ignore. Gregor once told you, you'll never get rich doing this work, but you'll always have employment. It was either reassuring or threatening, and you still weren't entirely sure which interpretation was correct. You attempted negotiating once, approaching the magistrate with reasonable observations about tool maintenance costs, rope replacement schedules, and the rising price of cleaning supplies. He nodded thoughtfully, agreed with all your points, and handed you a single copper coin with a note saying, "Thank you for your continued discretion." You couldn't exactly threaten to quit. There weren't competing employers offering better benefits packages, and your resume would have been challenging to explain to potential new careers. Excellent with knots, experienced in spatial reasoning, skilled at crowd control one person at a time. So you stayed, developed budgeting skills, learned to repair equipment rather than replacing it, and became remarkably creative with questionable ingredients in cooking pots. You made it work through necessity and resourcefulness. The irony was that your job involved applying pressure professionally, but financially you lived under constant pressure yourself. They feared your tools and respected your skills, but when payment was delayed, you feared the baker, the cobbler, and every other tradesman who expected actual money for goods and services. But let me tell you about the rules and regulations that governed your profession, because contrary to popular belief, medieval torture wasn't just a free-for-all of creativity and poor decision-making. There were rules, not necessarily good rules or clear rules, but definitely rules. You couldn't just wake up on Tuesday and decide to question someone because they owned too many cats or seemed suspiciously well-rested. No, you needed proper authorization, usually from a magistrate, occasionally from clergy. and once from a man claiming royal appointment whose boots suggested otherwise. The law stated that enhanced interrogation was a last resort, to be used only when conventional questioning had failed. In practice, conventional questioning often meant we asked him twice and he seemed evasive, but technically there were standards. Guidelines existed, sort of. You weren't supposed to cause permanent damage, at least not officially. Anything that left someone unable to walk, work, or remember their own name was officially frowned upon, unless they confessed first, in which case it became an unfortunate but effective accident. Record keeping was required, which usually meant scratching vague notes into wax tablets with entries like subject uncooperative, applied standard encouragement, which could mean anything from a stern conversation to 4 turns of the wheel and dramatic pausing for effect. A priest was often required to be present, theoretically to ensure spiritual welfare, while you tested the practical limits of skeletal engineering. He rarely intervened unless it was time for theological debates or meal breaks. Certain devices were officially banned, though mostly because they were impractical rather than excessively cruel. Iron maidens, for example, weren't used because they were largely mythical. You had to work with actual tools like cranks, wheels, and that thing with the adjustable grip. What this meant was that you operated in a strange professional space where pain was officially sanctioned, but carefully regulated. You were always one excessive day away from being called unnecessarily enthusiastic, a career development that usually ended in either dismissal or sudden promotion to positions with even worse working conditions. So, yes, your work was regulated, just not in ways that made anyone feel particularly comfortable about the whole arrangement. Which brings us to retirement, or rather, the complete absence of retirement planning in your profession. There were no farewell ceremonies, no gold watches, no parchment scrolls thanking you for years of dedicated joint-related service. You didn't retire from being a torturer. You simply stopped showing up to work. Assuming you lived long enough and remained physically capable. The job didn't include long-term planning or pension benefits. Nobody explained what happened when your hands started shaking or your knees began clicking like rusty hinges. You just became slower, less precise, and in a profession where precision was the difference between confession and complication, that was professionally problematic. Gregor never officially retired. One day, he handed you his personal gloves, nodded once like he was passing down the family cow, and walked out of the dungeon into morning mist like something from a cautionary folk tale. Nobody saw him again, though you assumed he died peacefully, probably while cleaning something unnecessarily sharp. You had no plans to live long enough for retirement concerns. There were whispered stories, always vague, of practitioners who tried walking away, moving to different villages, changing names, opening bakeries. But somehow word always spread. When townsfolk discovered their daily bread came from someone who once professionally operated the rack, business tended to decline rapidly. One former colleague tried reinventing himself as a traveling herbalist. His potions were surprisingly effective. So effective that locals accused him of witchcraft and burned his cart. Last anyone heard, he was working as a scarecrow, voluntarily this time. The truth was that reputation followed you like smoke from a persistent fire. It clung to your clothes, your voice, your silhouette against sunset. Even if you stopped practicing, people didn't forget. You weren't a blacksmith or cobbler who could simply change careers. You were the person who once had a room with specific equipment and a very particular skill set. So you stayed quietly, trained apprentices when they appeared, accepted fewer assignments as arthritis developed, and learned to sit more often than standing. The town pretended you were still around, available when needed, but preferably invisible otherwise. Eventually, someone younger would take your position. They always did. When that day came, maybe you'd walk away like Gregor, disappearing into mist and obscurity, into whatever part of town people went when they wanted to be forgotten. Just not yet. There was still work to be done, still secrets to extract, still a living to make in the only profession you'd ever known. Years passed like pages in a book nobody wanted to read but couldn't quite put down. People came and went, wars started and ended, taxes rose and fell, plagues visited like unwelcome relatives. But you remained, a constant in the background of village life, like an uncomfortable architectural feature nobody wanted to acknowledge, but everyone knew was structurally important. Nobody expected you to have a legacy. Torturers don't get those. They get whispered about in taverns when ale flows freely and conversation turns dark. They get blamed for local curses and mentioned in stories parents tell to keep children well behaved. But among officials, your name was spoken with peculiar reverence. Not respect exactly, more like administrative relief. You were reliable, quiet, efficient. The human equivalent of a specialized tool kept behind a locked door. You never married because, how do you introduce yourself? Hello, I extract state-approved truth for a living. Interested in a walk? Friends remained rare. Your apprentice came closest, the unfortunate young man who eventually stopped asking questions and started oiling equipment with the same methodical care you once had. You taught him everything, including tricks for keeping gloves from cracking during winter and techniques for maintaining mental equilibrium in morally ambiguous circumstances. He never thanked you, which meant he was learning properly. Gratitude would have suggested he didn't understand the true nature of the work. One winter, a visiting bishop inquired about local justice procedures. The magistrate simply pointed toward your section of the building. The bishop nodded once, asked no follow-up questions, and moved on to discussing grain tithes and roof repairs. When people told stories about local affairs, they never used your name. You were the man in the basement, or the one who handles difficult conversations. A role more than a person, a function rather than an individual. A necessary fixture like a well or gallows that served community needs without requiring personal recognition. You once considered carving your initials into the wooden bench where you sat during quiet moments, but it felt unnecessary. The room already remembered you in more permanent ways than carved letters ever could. If you had a legacy, it wasn't written in stone or recorded in official documents. It was silence, the particular quiet that followed successful confessions, the empty streets when you passed by, the heavy door that never needed labels because everyone understood its purpose. When you were finally gone, nobody would speak of it directly, which felt entirely appropriate. Medieval torturers didn't get eulogies or monument dedications. They got forgotten professionally and remembered personally by everyone who'd ever heard their footsteps in the corridor. But before we close the book on your life of professional unpleasantness, let's talk about the psychological toll, because nobody becomes a torturer and walks away mentally unchanged. You might think the job would turn you into a monster, and maybe it did, just not in the way people expected. The first thing that happened was emotional numbing, not by choice but by necessity. You couldn't afford to feel sympathy for every person brought to your workspace, partly because sympathy would make you ineffective, mostly because you'd go insane before your first year ended. So you developed professional detachment, the ability to see people as problems to be solved rather than humans experiencing suffering. This detachment leaked into other areas of your life like water through cracked stone. You stopped getting excited about village festivals or upset about minor disappointments. Food tasted bland. Conversations seemed trivial, and emotional extremes of any kind felt foreign and exhausting. You weren't depressed exactly, just operating on a narrower emotional spectrum than most people. Sleep became complicated, not because of guilt necessarily, but because your mind had been trained to remain alert, to listen for sounds that might indicate problems requiring immediate attention. You never fully relaxed, even in your own bed, even on days when no work was scheduled. Your body existed in a state of constant readiness that made genuine rest nearly impossible. Dreams, when they came, weren't nightmares about screaming victims or pools of blood. They were stranger than that. Dreams about broken tools, about being called to work but unable to find your gloves, about standing in empty rooms wondering why nobody was talking. Your subconscious processed stress in metaphors rather than direct replays, which was somehow more unsettling. You developed habits that made sense professionally but seemed odd socially. You automatically assessed the physical vulnerabilities of everyone you met, noting which joints looked weak, which people might be left-handed, how much pressure different body types could probably withstand. It wasn't malicious, just occupational conditioning, like how blacksmiths noticed poor metalwork or farmers recognized unhealthy livestock. Relationships became nearly impossible, not just because of social stigma, but because emotional intimacy required vulnerability you could no longer access. How do you explain to someone that you spent Tuesday afternoon encouraging a grain merchant to reconsider his testimony about wheat prices? How do you discuss your day without mentioning the interesting sounds people make when properly motivated? Yet, despite all this psychological adaptation, you retained your basic humanity in unexpected ways. You still felt sad when the old priest died, still enjoyed watching children play in the square from a distance, still appreciated well-made bread and decent ale. The job didn't turn you into a complete sociopath, just someone carrying invisible weight that nobody else could see or understand. Some practitioners in your field turned to drink, others to religion, a few to madness. You chose routine and professional pride, maintaining equipment, perfecting techniques, and finding satisfaction in work done competently, even when the work itself was morally questionable. And here's what nobody tells you about being a torturer. The job taught you things about human nature that most people never learned. You discovered that everyone, absolutely everyone, had breaking points, but those points weren't where most people expected them to be. Some nights crumbled after mild discomfort, while some peasants endured incredible hardship without revealing anything significant. You learned that people lied most creatively when they were comfortable, but told unexpected truths when under pressure. You discovered that guilt and innocence weren't always obvious, that some of the most cooperative subjects were genuinely guilty, while some of the most resistant had nothing meaningful to confess. Most importantly, you learned that justice and truth weren't the same thing, that confessions extracted under duress weren't always accurate, and that the legal system cared more about closure than correctness. But you also learned that sometimes, unfortunately, your methods did produce genuine confessions that solved real crimes and helped real victims. This moral complexity was perhaps the hardest part of your job, harder than the social isolation or physical demands. You couldn't simply categorize yourself as good or evil because the reality was more complicated than moral absolutes allowed. You were a tool used by a system that was sometimes just, sometimes corrupt, always imperfect. But let's shift away from psychology and discuss the technical aspects of your profession, because efficiency in your line of work required genuine skill and knowledge that went far beyond simply hurting people until they talked. Understanding anatomy was crucial, not just knowing where things were located, but how they connected, what could be stressed without permanent damage, and how different body types responded to various forms of persuasion. You learned that tall, thin people had different tolerance patterns than short, stocky individuals, that old injuries created weak points, and that someone's occupation could predict how they'd react to specific techniques. Timing was an art form. Too much pressure too quickly, and subjects either passed out or became so overwhelmed they couldn't communicate coherently. Too little pressure and they'd realize you weren't actually willing to cause serious harm, which destroyed your credibility entirely. The goal was finding that perfect middle ground where discomfort encouraged cooperation without preventing clear communication. Reading people became second nature, not just their physical responses, but their psychological tells. Some people broke early and tried to bargain. Others held out until the last possible moment before revealing everything. A few told elaborate lies that sounded more convincing than truth. Learning to distinguish between genuine confessions and desperate fabrications was crucial for maintaining professional reputation. Equipment maintenance was surprisingly complex. Metal components needed regular oiling to prevent rust and ensure smooth operation. Wooden parts required treatment to prevent warping or cracking. Rope had to be inspected for fraying and replaced before it failed at crucial moments. Everything needed to be cleaned thoroughly after use, partly for sanitation, mostly to prevent evidence of previous sessions from affecting current ones. You also had to understand the legal framework within which you operated. Different crimes required different approaches. Heresy investigations followed different protocols than theft accusations. Political cases had additional complications because the wrong confession might implicate people you weren't supposed to investigate. Knowing when to push for specific information and when to accept vague admissions was essential for avoiding professional complications. Temperature control mattered more than most people realized. Cold rooms made subjects more uncomfortable but also made them less responsive. Overly warm spaces caused fainting and dehydration. The ideal workspace maintained a steady temperature that kept people alert but not comfortable, aware but not panicked. Nutrition and hydration were practical considerations. Subjects who were too hungry or thirsty couldn't think clearly enough to provide useful information. But those who were too comfortable might decide they could wait out the session. Finding the right balance between basic needs and motivational discomfort required experience and judgment. Even lighting played a role. Too dim and subjects couldn't see what might happen next, which limited psychological pressure. Too bright and they could see too much, potentially causing panic that interfered with coherent communication. The best setups used indirect lighting that suggested rather than revealed, leaving imagination to fill in details. All of these technical requirements meant that becoming truly competent in your profession took years of practice and observation. You weren't just learning to cause pain, you were mastering a complex skill set that combined elements of medicine, psychology, engineering, and performance art into something uniquely effective and uniquely disturbing. Now, let's discuss the broader historical context of your profession. Because torture wasn't a medieval invention, and your role fit into a much larger pattern of how societies have approached justice, truth, and social control throughout human history. Ancient civilizations had been using enhanced interrogation techniques for centuries before you were born. Romans developed sophisticated methods that influenced medieval practices. Greeks had legal frameworks that included torture for certain classes of people under specific circumstances. Even earlier cultures had ritualized approaches to extracting truth through controlled suffering. What made the medieval period distinctive wasn't the existence of torture, but its systematic integration into legal proceedings. Your job existed because society had decided that truth was valuable enough to justify significant moral compromise, and that some people were qualified to make those compromises professionally on behalf of the community. The theological framework was particularly important during your era. Church authorities argued that saving souls sometimes required extreme measures, that temporary physical suffering was acceptable if it prevented eternal damnation. This religious justification made your work not just legally acceptable, but morally necessary, at least according to official doctrine. Political considerations were equally complex. Rulers used controlled violence to maintain social order, demonstrate power, and gather information about potential threats. Your skills served multiple functions beyond simple law enforcement, helping to prevent rebellions, identify conspiracies, and send messages to anyone considering activities that might disrupt established authority. Economic factors also influenced your profession. Crime affected commerce, property rights, and tax collection. Merchants needed assurance that contracts would be enforced, that theft would be punished, and that business disputes would be resolved. Your work contributed to economic stability by ensuring that legal agreements had meaningful consequences. Social class played a huge role in how your services were applied. Nobles and wealthy merchants often received different treatment than peasants and laborers, not just in terms of the techniques used, but in the standards of evidence required for conviction. Your profession existed within a broader system of inequality that shaped every aspect of medieval life. International relations sometimes involved your expertise as well. Treaties included provisions about extradition and information sharing. Diplomatic incidents could result in foreign nationals being brought to your workspace. War prisoners might require questioning about military plans or political alliances. Your local skills occasionally served broader strategic purposes. Understanding this historical context helps explain why your profession existed and persisted for so long. You weren't an aberration or historical accident, but a logical development within a system that prioritized certain values over others, that accepted violence as a legitimate tool of governance, and that believed truth was more important than the methods used to obtain it. This doesn't excuse or justify what you did, but it explains how someone could pursue such a career without considering themselves evil. You were operating within accepted social norms, following established legal procedures, and serving recognized community needs. The fact that later generations would judge your profession harshly doesn't change the reality that within your own time and place, you were performing necessary work according to contemporary standards. But let's return to your personal experience and discuss the day-to-day details that defined your working life. Because the mundane aspects of professional torture were often more psychologically challenging than the dramatic moments everyone imagined. Most days didn't involve actual sessions with subjects. Instead, you spent time maintaining equipment, updating records, consulting with legal authorities, and preparing for potential work. The anticipation was often worse than the activity itself, sitting in your workshop wondering if today would bring another assignment, another person who needed encouragement toward truthfulness. Scheduling was irregular and unpredictable. Sometimes weeks passed without any calls for your services. Other times you'd have multiple consultations in a single day, each requiring different approaches and techniques. You couldn't plan your time effectively because urgent situations arose without warning, usually when someone important demanded immediate answers to pressing questions. Paperwork was surprisingly extensive. Every session required documentation, not detailed descriptions, but enough information to satisfy legal requirements and provide reference material for future cases. You had to record names, dates, techniques used, information obtained, and recommendations for follow-up actions. This administrative work took more time than most people realized. Consultation meetings with magistrates, priests, and other authorities were frequent and often more complicated than the actual torture sessions. These officials wanted results, but didn't want to know details. They needed information, but preferred maintaining plausible deniability. Navigating these conversations required diplomatic skills that weren't part of your formal training. Supply management was an ongoing concern. You needed rope, oil, candles, cleaning materials, replacement parts for mechanical devices, and various consumable items. Some supplies were expensive and difficult to obtain. Others were readily available, but required regular replenishment. Budgeting and inventory control weren't glamorous aspects of your job, but they were essential for maintaining operational readiness. Professional development was limited, but not entirely absent. Occasionally, you'd encounter colleagues from other jurisdictions, usually during regional legal proceedings or religious gatherings. These meetings provided opportunities to discuss techniques, share experiences, and learn about innovations in equipment or methodology. Such conversations had to be discreet because even professionals in your field preferred not to advertise their expertise publicly. Seasonal variations affected your work patterns. Winter sessions were more challenging because cold rooms made subjects less responsive and equipment more difficult to operate. Summer brought problems with heat, ventilation, and hygiene. Spring and fall were generally preferred for intensive work, though you rarely had control over scheduling based on weather preferences. Health considerations were important for both subjects and yourself. You had to monitor people for signs of serious medical problems that might interfere with information extraction. You also had to protect your own physical well-being because injury or illness could make you unable to work, and there were no sick leave policies or disability benefits in your profession. All of these mundane details combined to create a working life that was simultaneously routine and extraordinary, predictable and utterly unpredictable. You were a civil servant with very unusual duties, a craftsman working with human materials, a professional whose expertise was essential, but whose methods made most people profoundly uncomfortable. Let me tell you about the relationship between your profession and the various religious authorities in your community, because this connection was more complex and important than most people understood